It's time to dive back into the tangled web of Season 4 Part 1 of You. Buckle up, because London was anything but a fresh start for our favorite stalker. In a flashback, Joe Goldberg tracks down Marion in London, but chooses to let her go after she calls him a murderer. Joe is later met by Elliot Tannenberg, a fixer working for Love's father, who sets him up with a cover identity in exchange for killing Marion to tie up loose ends. Joe instead pickpockets Marion's necklace and sends its picture to Elliot to make it appear he killed her. In the present, Joe lives under his new identity as Jonathan Moore, a university English professor. He develops an interest in Kate Galvin, the girlfriend of his obnoxious fellow professor Malcolm Harding, who lives in the flat across from him. Joe saves Kate from two muggers. To repay him, Malcolm invites him to a party at the elite Sundry House, where Joe befriends author and mayoral hopeful Reese Montrose. Joe gets heavily intoxicated at the party and awakens in his flat to find Malcolm stabbed to death and missing a finger. Assuming he killed Malcolm before blacking out, Joe disposes of his body. The next day, Kate invites Joe to dinner. As Joe arrives, he receives a series of anonymous texts from Malcolm's real killer, thanking him for disposing of the evidence. Joe recalls a reference to the artwork in Malcolm's ledger and believes Simon killed Malcolm to avoid being extorted. However, Simon is murdered that night, with the killer cutting off one of his ears. Joe returns home to find his wall covered in newspaper clippings from his past, the killer having deduced his real identity. The killer sends Malcolm's finger to the press and is dubbed the Eat the Rich Killer. Joe discovers his student Nadia was in a sexual relationship with Malcolm. At Simon's funeral, the killer orders Joe to kill Kate. Joe follows Kate around to protect her. Though initially cold to Joe, Kate eventually opens up to him and the two have sex, unaware that Vic is watching them. The killer suggests Joe is aroused by murder. Joe plays along and tells the killer to let him finish Kate, and the killer arranges a meeting with him. Phoebe calls Joe to Sundry House, where the police are waiting to question him. Joe is invited to Phoebe's family's country manor for a weekend getaway. Joe comes at odds with Roald Walker Burton, Kate's childhood friend, who, as Joe discovers, is obsessed with her. Kate later reveals to Joe that her father is a powerful investor with whom she cut ties due to the harm his business dealings have done to the world. Joe realizes he may be in love with Kate. He runs to find Kate, only to discover her kneeling over Gemma's corpse with a knife in hand. Kate insists she did not kill Gemma. Joe comes to believe her and helps her dispose of the body in a barn while the others are partying. Kate confronts Joe about his past after noticing his apparent experience with covering up murders. Joe admits that he disposed of Malcolm's body and that whoever framed him is now trying to frame Kate. Kate goes to tell Phoebe to dismiss the servant staff. While she is away, Roald discovers Joe in the barn and brings him to the others, accusing him of being the killer. Despite Joe's protests, Roald gives him a head start to flee before pursuing him with a shotgun. Joe subdues Roald in the woods, only to be captured and placed in a dungeon by the real killer, Reese, who, having come from poverty, committed the murders out of hatred towards the rich. Reese tells Joe to kill Roald so they can frame him for the murders. When Joe refuses, Reese sets the dungeon on fire and leaves. Joe escapes and frees Roald, and the two are rescued by Kate. Joe does not tell the others about Reese and vows to bring him down himself. Reese announces his candidacy for mayor of London. Reese forces Joe to find someone to frame for the murders and places Simon's severed ear in his freezer. Joe initially plans to frame Connie, a member of the Oxford group who confides his struggles with addiction, but later relents when Connie decides to get clean. At Kate's latest gallery fundraiser, Phoebe is held captive in a hotel room by Dawn, a woman posing as a waitress who has a parasocial obsession with her. Joe negotiates his way into the room and plants Simon's ear in Dawn's bag before the police arrive, thus getting Dawn arrested for the Eat the Rich murders. Nadia, who witnesses the arrest, becomes suspicious of Joe. Adam proposes to Phoebe, but Phoebe, who learned of his financial problems from Dawn, rejects him. Joe and Kate admit their feelings for one another after Kate promises not to inquire into Joe's past. Reese gives Joe a final task: kill his rival political donor Tom Lockwood, Kate's father. Joe accompanies Kate to dinner with her father, who is visiting London. Lockwood reveals he knows Joe's real identity. Lockwood soon gets an article published revealing that Reese fabricated much of his memoir. Reese reveals he has kidnapped Marion and forces Joe to kill Lockwood to save her. Phoebe struggles with PTSD symptoms after her kidnapping. Kate arranges her stay at a clinic, but Phoebe instead decides to marry Adam. Joe prepares to kill Lockwood, but Lockwood instead enlists him to kill Reese, giving him the location of a countryside cottage where Reese has gone into hiding since the publication of the exposé. Joe finds Reese, who claims he doesn't know who Joe is. Joe tortures Reese for Marion's location. Reese pleads his innocence, but Joe ends up killing him, only to then discover that the Reese he has been interacting with has been a figment of his imagination. Nadia, meanwhile, finds a key in Joe's apartment that leads to a room where Marion has been trapped in a glass cage. Joe is revealed to have drugged and kidnapped Marion before she could leave London and locked her in a glass cage in the basement of an abandoned building across from Reese's favorite restaurant. Joe had been exhaustively researching Reese's life, finding commonalities between Reese's story of rising out of a life of crime and poverty and his own desire for moral redemption. Upon imprisoning Marion, Joe suffered a psychotic break that caused him to dissociate, resulting in gaps in his memory where he kidnapped Marion and later committed the murders. Having forgotten he kidnapped Marion, Joe left her to starve in the cage. The Reese in Joe's visions proclaims himself to be a figment of his darker impulses and helps him remember where he kept the key to Marion's location. Joe arrives at the building at the same time Nadia explains to Marion her plan to help her escape. Nadia manages to hide while a horrified Joe finds Marion and promises to set her free. Joe and Kate attend Adam and Phoebe's wedding party and attempt to convince Phoebe, whose mental state has declined, not to marry Adam. Phoebe is later committed to psychiatric care after suffering a breakdown at the party. Adam is killed by hitmen posing as prostitutes, who, as Kate learns, were sent by her father. She refuses his request to take over his business. Joe takes Phoebe's diazepam to expunge his visions of Reese, but experiences a nightmare in which he sees Gemma, Beck, and Love, which convinces him the only way to end his obsessive cycle is to kill himself. He awakens to go free Marion, only to find she overdosed on medication he left for her earlier. Believing Marion to have died, Joe disposes of her body at a park to make her look like she overdosed. Nadia, however, tells Edward that she and Marion plotted to fake the latter's death by replacing her medication with beta blockers that lowered her blood pressure so that she could escape. Kate tells Joe that her father revealed himself to have bankrolled her every venture even after their estrangement and confides her fear of never escaping his control. Joe kills Lockwood and the next morning attempts suicide by jumping off a bridge. However, the police rescue him. He awakens in the hospital to find Kate, who tells him she has inherited all her father's assets and has already covered up Joe's involvement in Reese's death. Joe decides to accept his darker half. He kills Edward and frames Nadia for the crime. Sophie and Princess blessing by Sundry House, which Roald and Connie continue to frequent with no signs of change. After rehab, Lady Phoebe moves to Thailand to teach children. While Marion reads an article about Joe while safely home with Juliet back in Paris, Joe moves back to New York City with Kate, who runs her father's business after his death and helps Joe rehabilitate his public image as Love's escaped victim. And if you want to stay tuned for more breakdowns, theories, and recaps of your favorite shows, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.